Hello, welcome to the recorded version of the study orientation for the ANDHII feasibility study. My name is William Murphy. I'm the Senior Manager of Outcomes Research for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and I'll be guiding you through this orientation. I want to thank everybody for volunteering to participate in this research study. We definitely appreciate your time. Participating will take approximately 5 weeks in total, and you'll use ANDHII for just 5 of your patients. We'll ask you to report information about how much time it takes to provide care when you're using ANDHII for those 5 patients, and also to report information about how much time it takes to provide care to 4 randomly selected patients that you're not using ANDHII for, so that we can compare. What we'll discuss in this orientation is what ANDHII is, how to use ANDHII, how to select which patients to include in the study and whether to use ANDHII or just collect time data for them, how to report that time data that you've collected, and the anonymous survey at the end of the study to submit your perceptions and feedback. So ANDHII is short for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Health Informatics Infrastructure. It's a set of web-based applied health informatics tools that assist in the collection and analysis of patient outcome and clinical practice pattern data. The purpose of ANDHII is to complete our evidence-based practice cycle. In this chart you see what happens right now for evidence-based practice in dietetics, and it's similar to what happens for evidence-based practice in the other allied health professions, but this one is specific to dietetics and our language and processes. So the center of evidence-based practice is evidence-based practice guidelines. Those are generated, in our case by the Evidence Analysis Library, by synthesizing the data that's available both from clinical research, your randomized controlled trials and your prospective cohorts, and outcomes research, your real-world assessment of what's happening in practice, and making, based on the best available evidence, our guidelines on what the best way to provide care for our patients is. Once those guidelines are made, you, our practitioners, our members, use the guidelines and translate them using both the ANDHII, that's the International Dietetics and Nutrition Terminology, and the nutrition care process to translate guidelines into actual patient care or clinical practice. Now the problem with this cycle is that it doesn't close. It's not a cycle at all. So the purpose of ANDHII is to close up this loop and take what's happening in clinical practice and get analyzable data out of it so that we can increase that bubble of outcomes research. This is important because our guidelines are only ever as good as the evidence that's available. And sometimes there's not enough evidence to make the best conclusions, and sometimes the evidence that is available doesn't end up translating well into real-world practice. And so what ANDHII enables us to do is look at what's happening in practice and evaluate how well these guidelines are working, so that we can, on one hand, identify ones that are working really well and promote that, and on the other hand, look for any areas that we have for improvement as a profession and reevaluate our guidelines in order to provide the best possible care. At the same time, increasing the amount of outcomes research for dietetics care that's available helps our efforts in our Washington, D.C. office, both for determining academy positions and for promoting public policy. Now, for ANDHII to work, in addition to the technical and infrastructure side, we want it to be something that's usable, that our members will want to use, and that isn't a huge burden to your day. And so we've built a lot of tools into ANDHII to make it more than just an outcomes registry, but a full health informatics infrastructure with a suite of tools that benefit you as the individual practitioner for using ANDHII. And so we're going to include it as a member benefit for all of our members so that it doesn't cost you anything extra to use ANDHII's basic functionality. We have some help with picking IDNT terms. I think we're all pretty competent in the diagnostic terms and the intervention terms. They're pretty short and they're pretty well used, but the assessment and monitoring and evaluation terminology, we still have a lot of work in getting that adopted in the profession. And I think one of the obstacles is just how many terms there are in the terminology. And so with intelligent suggestions and autocomplete, we help you find the terms that you're looking for quickly. With autocomplete, you can start typing the IDNT term you want, and that huge list of terms filters down to just the similar terms, so you can find the term you want and click on it without flipping through pages and pages of a reference manual. And Intelligent Suggestions goes another step and tries to predict or anticipate what term you're going to want next to save you the trouble of having to look for it at all. We also offer customizable plain text visit reports. What that does is take all the data you've entered into ANDHII and translate it into a narrative format that you can customize to meet your particular note templates and note writing style, so that you may have some text that, depending on your facility procedures, you could copy and paste into the medical record to save you time on documentation. And finally, we offer tools for you to be able to use the data you're giving us, because putting the data into the system helps us at a national level, but with all that data in there, there's plenty of ways that it could help you in your practice as well. And so we have some chart building tools where you can visually track patient progress. You can get much more than what you may find in your current electronic medical record, because we'll also have data about dietary intake and nutrition interventions that you can put alongside labs and anthropometrics. And we also offer a crosstab report builder that allows you to take the data you've put into ANDHII and export it in a spreadsheet that you could then use to make reports or other graphs or do statistical analysis. So I want to talk for a minute about the IRB and the legalities and the structure of this research study. The way this study is designed is that Marty Adrick and I and the investigators of the Academy are studying you as dietitians in terms of how using ANDHII affects your practice and your attitudes on ANDHII. So as research subjects, it's important to know that you are free to discontinue the study at any time without any repercussions. We are offering compensation for your time in the amount of $15 for each visit you enter into ANDHII, and that is independent of whether you end up completing the full study or not. You'll be paid for the visits that you completed. If you'd like to receive this compensation, though, we have to do a tax form which involves some personal information, and so it's up to you whether you want to or not. I'll provide you the tax form via email, and you can send it back to me in the mail or through fax or through email if you want to receive the compensation. Now, in this study, you'll also be entering data about your patients into ANDHII, but we're not asking you to do anything different in terms of the actual care that you provide for your patients. And ANDHII uses a de-identification system to make sure that the data you put in can't be linked back to the actual patients in any way. And because of that, our IRB has determined that your interaction with the patients does not constitute research, because you're providing usual care and you're only giving us de-identified data, which is different from protected health information. And as such, no local human subjects research IRB approval is necessary. However, we don't want anyone to get on the bad side of their local IRBs, so we are more than happy to discuss this with your IRB staff. If you need, just let me know through email. Now I'm going to talk about how to use ANDHII. You will get an activation email after you let me know that you've watched this training, and you'll click on a link in there to set your password. After that, you can access ANDHII through andhi.org. Now I'm going to switch over to the ANDHII application on the web and show you some of the steps. So the first step is signing in, and to do that you'll use your email address and the password that you set through the activation email. When you sign into ANDHII, the first thing that you'll always see is a patient screen. Now, this will show any patients that you've entered into the study already. They'll all be listed for you by re-identification code, which is just a randomly generated string. This is part of the de-identification system in ANDHII, and that it's not derived from a social number or birthday or anything like that. It's random, but you can save it, and it allows you to re-identify that patient to put more data in about them without ever giving us at ANDHII and at the Academy any idea of who that person really is. When you're entering a new patient, you'll use the Add Patient button below the list of patients, and that will bring up a dialog to ask you which project to add the patient to. Now, you'll only have one option because you're just doing the ANDHII feasibility study, so all you'll need to do is click Add Patient to this project. Then it'll ask you to give information about the patient. Now again, since this is a de-identified project, you won't be able to put very much information about the patient at all, just country and state. When you are done with that, you will choose Save and Add an Entry, and that will take you directly into the Visit Entry screen. Now this is the Visit Entry screen. And there are a few items on the screen that I want to point out. First is that re-identification code again that allows you to know what patient this is. I'll talk later after the visit is done on how you can save that to make sure you always have it available when you need it. Next is the entry date. This can't be changed because it's just recording the day that you've put the data in. We can't record the day of any dates that are directly related to a patient because that would be identifiable information. And so if you end up entering the ANDHII visit the next day for whatever reason, you can't change it back to the previous day because we're not recording the day you saw the patient, we're recording the day you entered the data. Below that you'll see the data entry area, and this is divided up by the 4 steps of the nutrition care process: assessment, diagnosis, intervention, and monitoring and evaluation. Below those is very important the Save and Finalize buttons. Now ANDHII, in order to be secure, has an automatic logout function. If there's no activity within a certain amount of time, it will log you out. And if you haven't saved the entry, you'll lose the data that you've entered. And we don't want you to have to spend a bunch of time entering data again. That's very frustrating. So anytime you need to step away from the computer or answer a phone call or look at something else for a few minutes, simply push the Save Entry button. It'll save the work you've done so far so that if you do get logged out, you'll be able to come right back in and complete the note. The Finalize Entry button will save your work and fix it so that it can't be changed, and that will be the end of that visit. So you don't want to push that button until you're finished with the visit that you're doing, because you can't add any more. So with each step of ANDHII, we use the ID&T terms to identify the data that you're putting in. And we have these ID&T term lookup boxes to help you find the right term. And we talked about these a little bit before with the intelligent suggestions and autocomplete. So when you want to put in an assessment, first thing you do is click in the selector box, and this will bring up the full list of assessment, monitoring, and evaluation terminology. Like I mentioned, it's a pretty exhaustive list, which is a boon to us as a profession because we can capture all sorts of patient data, but it could be a burden in terms of finding the right term that you want. So instead of scrolling through the list, you can just start typing the term that you're looking for. Here I start to type height, and the list filters down, and I see there's only one choice that matches that, height length, which is under AD 1.1. So when you find the term that you want, you can either use the mouse and click on it, or use the arrow keys if there's more than one to highlight it, and push the tab key to select it. I'll use the mouse this time. And now I'm ready to enter the value. That's whatever the number is, or the information, the data that you're putting in today. You can say we'll put in 71. Now for every term there's also an option for units/indicators. This allows you to give us a little bit more information about that number that you just typed, or the value that you just entered, or 71. And so there are basic unit options, centimeters or inches, if you're just entering the current basic height. But there are also other indicators that are combined with units so that you can specify this isn't just current height, but this is a different type of height, such as arm span, birth length, estimated height, knee height, or pre-amputated height. With each assessment, you'll also have a reference standard option. This is how you tell ANDHII what the current value is for your patient in terms of whether it's abnormal or normal or in goal or not in goal. And so you'll have three options for everything right now. That it's an individualized reference standard. That means it's not a universal reference standard or a practice-based guideline reference standard. It's custom to your patient, but you can still tell us how that relates to where the goal is, whether it's currently above goal, currently below goal, or currently in the goal range. The reference standard is important because that's how the intelligent suggestions work. They look for abnormal assessments to help you make your nutrition diagnosis. We could go ahead and enter another assessment. We'll say weight. So now when we start to type weight, we get more than one term because there are three terms that have the word weight in them. Preoccupation with weight under beliefs and attitudes, or weight and weight change under body composition. So I can use the arrow keys to select the one that I want and push tab, or again I could have used the mouse to click on it. And again, I'll enter the value. I'll look if I want to change the units or any indicators, and you will remember the units that you used most recently for each term and choose them as the default next time, so that if you're always using metric or you're always using imperial, it'll know that and have it ready for you, so you don't have to click it every time. Again, we have the same reference standard options, and we also have a fourth option for weight of method/source. This gives us one more piece of information about the data you're entering, and that's where did it come from. So for weight, we have measured, stated, or unknown. In addition to anthropometric data, there is, of course, biochemical data that you may want to enter about a patient, and so you could choose albumin. See, I started typing albumin, and it filtered it down to albumin or prealbumin. I could pick the one that I want, choose the current value, the units are okay, the reference standard is okay, I just move on to the next one. Then you can push tab to move across each of the options and then get to the next box right away. If you don't want to switch back to the mouse, I could put, say, fasting glucose, and I'm going to put this one as an abnormal value so that we can see what happens with the intelligent suggestions. The units are fine, so don't need to open that, but for reference standard, I'm going to say it's currently above goal. So now ANDHII knows that's a high blood sugar. If I'm putting in glucose, I'll probably want to put in A1C, so I can just use the A1C to filter down to find that, and I can again put in a value. We'll say we'll give it another currently above goal. In addition to biochemical, of course, you have your ABCDs of nutrition assessment, and so the next would be clinical. And so this is where you could put in patient history data. I could say use endo to filter down to the patient, client, and family endocrine and metabolism history. And here, instead of a number, I'd be putting in text. And so I could say this patient has type 2 diabetes. The units will just be others, and the reference standard is not applicable. There are also the physical assessment components of the ANDHII assessment, monitoring, and evaluation terminology. And so we could look at the extremities, muscles, and bones terms, and you'll see these terms will have a lot of indicators because the ANDHII terms are categories, and then we use indicators to say specifically what's going on. A lot of these are yes, no, present, absent type terms. So like fatigue, I would just say fatigue is present, and that's it. You could other terms under there. If we go to extremities again, say you did a muscle assessment, we would choose muscle mass and specify, and then here's where you would type in text, and you could say that there is, say, 2+ temporal muscle wasting. You could describe what it is that you found when we don't have a specific yes-no option for it. The final category of nutrition assessment, of course, is dietary data. And so here, we can capture dietary data in a number of ways in ANDHII. One is the actual amounts of food that are eaten, the raw data that you would get from your diet assessment or 24-hour recall. For that, you use the food intake amount term. And this one, again, has a lot of indicators to pick from because they're all the different types of food that you may want to record and the different units they could be in. So say we want to record fruit and vegetable servings, and we can say that the amount would be 2 servings, just like that. Then, since there are other types of food, I just pick that food amount again, and this time I choose a different indicator. We can use, say, the servings of protein foods, and say that there were 5 protein food servings, and so on and so forth for the different data that you've gotten. Now there's also the results of your analysis of the recall. You could put in the nutrient intake data, and so of course there's total energy intake is a common one that you'd want to put in. And you can also do the specific nutrients. If we type carb, we'll get total carbohydrate intake. We could put in a number here for this patient. I can say that is above what I want for the patient with the high blood sugar, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a lot of assessment data available about your patients, and you could spend all day entering assessments, and we don't want you to do that. And so the key for assessment is to enter the data that's relevant to the patient case at hand instead of all the data that's available. So I'm not entering sodium for a patient with normal fluid status and normal sodium when it's not a concern. I'm entering the values that are relevant to this patient case. This is one of the areas where ANDHII is different from everything else out there in terms of outcomes registries. In most instances, the other registries try to decide what data is going to be relevant ahead of time and then ask every clinician to enter the same set of data for every patient. But that's not going to cut it for us because we have such a wide variety of practice areas within dietetics, and we can't predict ahead of time everything that's going to be relevant to the patient case, and if we tried, we would end up missing important data. And so here, ANDHII trusts your judgment and lets you pick what's important to that patient case so that we can look at all the facts together later and look at what's going on with patients in relation to nutrition care. When you've entered the assessment data that's important to your patient, you move on to diagnosis, and here again we have an ANDHII term selector. And so when we click in the box to open it, you'll see we have the terminology list again, but we also have at the top of the list suggestions. Now this is the intelligence suggestions. It's looked at what I said was abnormal in the assessment, and it's tried to guess which diagnostic term I might want. For this, it uses our nutrition assessment matrix, which is an online addition to the ANDHII manual that you can get off of eatright.org/NCP, where our nutrition care process standardized language committees have painstakingly mapped out the relationships between every assessment term and every diagnostic term. And so for high blood sugar values that we've put in and high carbohydrate intake values, our suggestions are excessive carbohydrate intake, inadequate fluid, and consistent carb intake are less than optimal types of carbohydrates. So if this is the diagnostic term you want, simply click it and move on. If it's not, of course, you have the full terminology list, and you can filter the list if you need to, just like above, by starting to type the term that you're looking for. We'll go ahead and pick one of the suggestions, excessive carbohydrate intake, and now it asks us for etiologies and signs and symptoms, but again, it's made some guesses at what terms we might want and pulled them up for easy access. This also uses matrices. There's another one that's an etiology matrix that relates those diagnostic terms to other diagnostic terms, and then there's the assessment matrix again, which helps us with signs and symptoms. So for etiologies, if it's found the one that you're looking for as a diagnostic term, you can simply click that, and that will be chosen as the etiology. If you wanted to put something else, you can click in the selector box and you'll see in here the full list of diagnostic terminology again, and you could choose a term from that. Or, since it's etiology, you can also enter something that's not in the list, like excessive sweetened beverage intake. And you'll see here, it still showed up in my list under custom etiologies because I've entered this before. So ANDHII remembers any etiologies that you use that are outside of the diagnostic term and will recommend them for you again in the future, so that if you're using something frequently, you don't have to type it out every single time. For signs and symptoms, again, we can choose and check anything in the list that we do want to use as a sign or symptom. And if there's anything that's in the list that we want that isn't recommended, you can simply open up the selector and find the term that you want and add it to the list. Diagnosis status is something that you may not be familiar with from the nutrition care process. It's in development right now in the committees. We want a standardized way of talking about this diagnosis. When you've made it in one visit and you follow up with it on the next visit, what happens to it? So the default will be new. When you do follow-up visits, it'll be changed to continued so that that diagnosis keeps showing up in future visits. And when you've resolved it or you're no longer going to address it, you can change it. We'll talk about that more when we get to the follow-up visit. When you've entered your diagnosis, and if you want to do more than one, you can. There's a blank box here to start another diagnosis. When you finish making your diagnoses, you move on to the intervention section. Now, our interventions are going to be grouped by etiology to help us remember to target our interventions on our underlying causes of our nutrition problems. Some etiologies, like food and nutrition related knowledge deficit, it again makes some intelligent suggestions to save you the trouble. So as a knowledge deficit, it brings up nutrition education, and here you can check off any education interventions that you are going to do. If there are other interventions you're going to do for that etiology that aren't brought up, you have a selector box here, and this is the intervention terminology. And then for other etiologies that don't have any suggestions, you'll use the blank box to choose how you're going to intervene on that etiology. Now, you'll see for each intervention there's a term and there's a details box. The reason for this is that our intervention terms are categorical and they aren't specific in terms of actual nutrition prescriptions and actual dietitian action. And so the details box allows you to give us the specifics of exactly what you're doing for that patient, so that we can look at that relationship between nutrition care and patient outcomes. And so here we could talk about the relationship of carbohydrate intake to glycemia. Under priority modifications, we could talk about reducing sweetened beverage intake. Under excessive sweetened beverage intake, I've chosen a carbohydrate modified diet, so then I could talk about exactly what carbohydrate modified diet. Here you'll see recent interventions. These are details that I've typed in before. So it's similar to what happened in etiologies. ANDHII remembers options that I've entered and offers them to me as a shortcut so that I don't have to type them out every single time when I'm using the same intervention frequently. When you finish describing your interventions, the final step is monitoring and evaluation. And this is where we decide what assessments we're going to do at the next visit to determine if our nutrition problem is getting better or is resolved. You'll see it's already partly filled out. What it's done is taken everything you picked as a sign and symptom and brought it down to the bottom, and then if any of those signs and symptoms were already filled out in your assessment, it went ahead and copied that value down for you as well. If there are any other monitors you want to add that aren't already brought up by the intelligent suggestions, you can just type it in using the selector to find the term. Now here you don't have to enter a value if it's something you're monitoring that you don't already know the current value of. You can leave that blank because you'll be entering the value at the next visit. When you have finished entering all the data for your patient visit, you will choose Finalize Entry. This will permanently save the data that you've put in and take you to the visit report. On the visit report screen, it's already picked the patient and the visit that you just entered. Don't worry about the timestamp there, it's the date that's important. You'll just need to pick something from the template list and it will make your note for you. The first thing you'll see in the note output is the patient identifier. This is that randomly generated re-identification string. And the best place to save this is by putting it in the progress note that you write for the patient in their medical record. This way it will definitely be available to you when you see the patient again, because you'll see it in your last note. Seeing it there will help you remember that this is an ANDHII patient and to enter the next visit into ANDHII. And keeping it in the medical record will keep it safe, since the medical record is already protected from disclosure under HIPAA regulations. You don't have to worry about that re-identification code and its link to the patient's identity getting released inadvertently, like it could if it was on a piece of paper. After that, you'll see this note has been written out in ANDHII format. You have nutrition assessment with the values that we've entered. You have nutrition diagnosis, and you see we've taken the diagnosis selections and it has translated them into a PES statement with related to here and as evidenced by right there. We have our nutrition intervention selections and the details that we put, and we have what we've selected to monitor and evaluate for the next visit. So, if your medical record takes all free text and your facility is okay with copy and paste, you can use the Select All Text button to highlight it, and then you can choose Copy. You can move it over into the medical record for documentation to save you the time of typing this information out. Now, odds are that your medical record isn't completely free text. It may have some structured data like the labs and the vitals already put in there for you, and it may even be choosing diagnostic terms for you from a list. So we can customize this output to meet exactly what you need. If you're already getting labs and vitals, we can filter the nutrition assessment to just be putting your dietary data and your client history data. And if you already got nutrition diagnosis structured in your medical record and you're picking that from lists, we can take that out and just put the other stuff. There is a markup language to do that, but I don't want anyone in this study to have to be spending time on figuring this out. So simply email me if you'd like, and I'll work with you to create a custom note template output for you to use that meets your needs exactly. After documenting the patient care and saving that re-identification code, that is the last step for entering a patient visit. Now, if you happen to see this patient again during their stay in your care, we want you to keep entering future visits on that patient into ANDHII. I don't want you to do any extra visits just for the sake of this study, but if you're going to see them, please continue to use ANDHII as long as they are in your care. So when it comes to doing a future visit, you'll come back into ANDHII, and when you've logged in, you see your patient list just like usual, and it'll have the patients you've seen before, but of course it's a bunch of re-identification codes, which can be hard to tell apart. So if you have that re-identification code saved in your progress note, you can highlight it and copy it and paste it into this search box, and that will filter down the list to just the patient that you're looking for, and then you choose New Entry to enter another visit about that patient. And when you do that, it'll take you again to that visit screen, but you'll see that there is some stuff already filled out for you. So everything that you selected as a monitor in the last visit will be brought up by default in the assessments, and if that data is available, you can enter it into the value box. If it's not available, or you decide you don't want to assess it after all, you can just ignore it and leave it blank, and ANDHII will delete it for you, or you can choose the X button to delete a row for something that you don't want listed in the assessment. You can enter the values that are relevant to the current case and choose the units and indicators and reference standards just as before. And you will see when you scroll down to the diagnosis step that your previous diagnosis is continued and copied over for you. If you need to, you can change the etiologies and signs and symptoms moving forward. If you want this diagnosis to continue to show up in future visits, you leave it as continued, no change needed. But if it's no longer relevant or is resolved, you can choose resolved or removed, and that will keep it from showing up in the next visit. Your interventions will be listed here from last time as well, so you can enter them again if you do the same intervention, or you can change the details or choose different options. And finally, you'll have your monitoring and evaluation, which will allow you to enter the data for what you've chosen to monitor and evaluate, keep tabs on the progress of your nutrition diagnosis. Again, remember to save entry if you need to step away so you don't lose your work, and finalize entry when you're done to move on to that visit report. Now I want to talk about patient selection, how to choose which patients end up in the ANDHII study. So for everyone in the study, I'll be making you a customized selection list. This list is randomly generated, and it's weighted based on how many patients you see. So I'll ask you to email me the average number of patients that enter your care every week. And then I'll make your custom list. And what it will do is be a list of 3 options: skip, time only, or ANDHII. For skip, that patient is not going to be related to the study at all. You just provide your usual care and don't do anything special for them in terms of the study. Since you're only using ANDHII for a few of your patients, skip is the option that you'll probably see the most. ANDHII, if you see it, then for that patient you're going to use ANDHII to enter this visit and all future visits during the submission for up to 2 weeks. If they end up in your care for longer than that, you can stop after 2 weeks. You'll also keep track of all the time devoted to patient care, and I mean the entire patient care time, including chart review, including direct patient care, including talking to other healthcare providers, and including documentation. We want to get the full scope of your time that's devoted to that patient that day, and then you'll enter that into our online time reporting, which I'll talk about next. Then the final option you may see is time only. For these patients, you don't want to use ANDHII. You want to provide your usual care, but you still want to keep track of time. This gives us that comparison so we can see how much time ANDHII takes in comparison to your normal care processes. After you've used a row in the list, you'll cross it off, and then the next time you get a new patient, you'll choose the next one. You'll want to use this every time a new patient enters your care. For any patients already in your care at the start of the study, just keep providing your usual care for them. For the time burden data, there is a SurveyMonkey server we've set up that collects the data we need for that. And so you'll use this URL, and I'll email it to you again every time you need to enter the time for a patient. First thing you put is your name. This allows us to aggregate the time records by each provider, but we will remove your names from it when we go to store this data and analyze it for research. We'll ask you whether or not you used ANDHII for this patient, so we know whether it's ANDHII or whether it's the time-only data. Then we'll ask you about how many visits you've had with that patient during this admission, regardless of whether you're using ANDHII or not. The point of this is to help us differentiate between initial visits, which tend to take more time, and follow-up visits, which tend to be quicker. Then we'll ask how many minutes you spent providing care to the patient during the visit, so that's the real question here. How much time did you devote to that patient? And the final question is your judgment of the patient's acuity level. Another factor that can impact how much time you spend with patients, aside from ANDHII and whether it's an initial visit, is how complicated the patient case is. And so you can choose from high, moderate, mild, or no nutrition risk to indicate just how complex that patient was. And when you've entered the data, you push done, and it'll be saved. And then just keep going back to the same URL for each other patient that you enter time for. After you've completed the study, we'll send you a link to an anonymous survey to give us your opinions about ANDHII and elicit feedback on how we can make ANDHII better, because we'll be doing revisions to it and more work prior to its release to the membership. That is the conclusion of the ANDHII orientation training. Appreciate your time and attention. Please feel free to contact me or Marty if you have any questions or any problems. We're here to help you through participation in this study. I will be, when you finish this training, do email me and let me know that you finished it, and I will send you the request for how many patients you see a week so I can make your selection list, and the W-9 tax form if you want to receive the compensation. Thank you.